Do oceans point us to a young Earth? That's something that an article recently published in Creation Magazine would like us to believe. I want to look at that particular article. I'm not so much interested in critiquing the individual arguments, but I'm interested in looking at the origins of the article and how such an article is constructed. Now, this article comes from creation.com, which is the web interface of the web presence of Creation Ministries International, a splinter group from Answers in Genesis about 10 years ago. They have a big presence in the southern U.S. and in Australia. This is the screenshot from the front page just today, and it shows the article I want to talk about, and that's this one right here, The Oceans Show Us a Young Earth, published 15 March 2021. It's published in their Creation magazine, which is not their form of peer-reviewed journal, but is more a popular journal that they push out to their followers. And this particular article was written by a Paul Price. Now, I didn't know anything about Paul Price, but if you know anything about, have watched any of my videos, you know that I'm interested in always understanding who the author is of an article, and I want to know something about what their ability to contribute is on this particular topic. And so I clicked on his name, and what I found out was this little bio is presented by CMI. He's a Christian. He studied apologetics and creation science for many years. And most importantly, he has a bachelor's in international affairs. All right, so he is not a scientist by training. He is familiar with the creation science literature. And before I look at the components of the article itself, or the argument of the article itself, let's just go right down to the bottom and take a look at the references and notes, because that's going to tell us a little bit about what his sources are, right? And if we look here, we'll see that his first source is from the International Conference of Creationism. He has an article from Creation he refers to, another article from Creation he refers to. This is Creation Magazine. It's the same magazine that he's writing an article for, right? Another article in Creation Magazine, and yet another article in Creation Magazine, and then something from the Creation Answers book. So you'll see that 6 out of 7 references are to other creation science literature. Many of those from Creation Magazine, which themselves are not necessarily peer-reviewed and are getting their information from yet other sources. And that's kind of the theme of this particular talk, is that often we find when somebody popularizes something that they are taking other people's information, right, and rewriting it. In this case, we have an author who doesn't really probably understand the original source material and hasn't looked at it, because he doesn't make any reference to original source material in the original scientific literature, and is just amplifying the message of others that have already written on this particular topic. And of course, he's presuming that those other people that he's referring to are actually experts and can analyze that scientific literature and come to appropriate conclusions. And so he's putting a lot of faith in these particular authors. And that therein lies a lot of the problem. Sometimes these, in fact a lot of times, the articles that are used as references in creation science journals are not really reputable articles, in the sense that those authors even have qualifications to examine the topic that they are talking about. But let's turn to the article itself. It has a very common theme and structure that you would find in a lot of creation science articles, and of course he has grown up in a creation science world in which he's read that particular literature. And so when he goes to write an article, he's simply mimicking the style and the information that he finds from other creation science writers. He starts out with the familiar, evolutionary biologists are uniformitarianism. They believe that all processes that you can look at today can be extrapolated into the past. Not really having a good grasp of modern uniformitarianism and what's also called actualism, that not all processes or all things happen at the same rates over time. Even if the fundamental processes of nature actually are consistent through time, that is the modern concept of uniformitarianism, that I can rely on the fact that the strong force that holds together nuclei is a measurement that when I measure it today would have been the same in the past as it is in the present. So he begins with that, and then he proceeds to tell us that because of uniformitarian principles, if evolutionary biologists were consistent, they would realize that the ocean has to be young because it can't possibly have been around as long as it was, or we wouldn't observe it as it is. So let's look at a couple of the things that he then goes on to say. He talks about where's all the seafloor sediment. All right, there's not as much seafloor sediment as you expect. If sediments have been flowing into the ocean basins for hundreds of millions of years, we would expect far more sediment to have built up on the ocean floor. On the face of it, it sounds like a very compelling and interesting argument. If in fact there are areas that have very little seafloor sediment. His description here suggests that he doesn't know anything more about this topic other than what he's read in the creation science literature. And I can tell you that that particular literature has been responded to over and over and over and over again by other Christians who have pointed out serious flaws in this particular argument, but this author probably is completely unaware of those particular flaws. And I just want to point out that there's a lot of different sources and places you can go to find these flaws. How about this page by James McKay, How Old is the Earth? And he has an article in which he responds to, actually a series of articles, he responds to Answers in Genesis, 10 best evidences, 10 best proofs that the world is young. And here are the types of proofs. Oh, look at what number one is. Number one proof that the world is young, sediments on the ocean floor. Right? So this author is just mimicking these common statements that, hey, there isn't enough sediment on the ocean's floor, and therefore the world can't be hundreds of millions of years old. Like I said, it's not hard to find information that shows serious errors with that thought. It's a little scary that Answers in Genesis thinks that these are the 10 best arguments that they have, right? And here we have listed this as number one. Actually, I don't think Answers in Genesis listed as number one. I think this is just the one that he approached first. But it is in the top 10. Of arguments. And then we're also going to see salt concentration in the oceans. That applies to the oceans as well, as another evidence that the world has to be young because there's not enough salt in the ocean. So you could go there. Oh, so here's our ocean salt problem, right? You know, he's saying the salinity of our oceans can give us a clock of sorts. Right? There's a certain amount of salt or sodium being deposited from erosion from continents that is being brought in the ocean. So the ocean should be getting saltier and saltier and saltier and saltier over time. There's only a little bit of measured salt leaving the ocean right now in the present day. And so he thinks that, and he thinks only because he's read this other literature by Austin and Humphreys, that and trusted their data, which others have written about the fact that they're using very old data and not modern estimates. So using estimates that were made with tools that really weren't the best tools of the time. And so they come to erroneous conclusions, and that needs to be updated. But this author doesn't realize that that needs to be updated. He's taking it on faith that this is still good evidence. But nonetheless, this also comes up against the whole uniformitarian principle. If you measured the amount of salt that's being lost from the ocean today, and then said, well, if that much is being lost, but this much salt's going in, then I could just extrapolate how old the ocean was when it had no salt in it. Seems logical, except that we know that the amount of salt in the ocean has changed over time, both from looking at deposits of sediments and being able to figure out salinity rates in the ocean over time. We know that salinity has gone up and down. It's not been something that's just constantly increased over time. So there is physical evidence that the salt in the ocean was higher at one time and much lower at other times. And therefore that suggests that there are methods and processes that actually remove salt from the ocean. And one of those is evaporation. A certain amount of evaporation occurs today, but we also know that if the oceans were much lower in the past, creating very thin plains of ocean across, or stranding ocean water across deep bodies in other areas, like the Dead Sea, then that salt eventually gets precipitated out. And so there are times in history in which massive amounts of salt have been evaporated from the ocean and left in salt deposits, and we find those salt deposits. So there's evidence of what we expect has happened in the past. Uniformitarianism in the sense that we're bound to believe that salt has to be coming out of the ocean at the same rate all the time during Earth's history. But the Earth has changed in terms of the amount of surface area of water on the surface. And the salinity has changed. And we could go on and on and on. I don't need to go on because you could find many other sources from Christians who have written about this, examine the evidence, and come to conclusions that this is not a solid evidence that, or a compelling evidence that the world is young. So again, James McKay has a really great article on that. And if you'd rather listen to me on the topic, but I'm trying to find you other sources, I've written a whole series of articles about the salty sea and talking about whether the oceans really are getting saltier over time or not. And the answer is, or not. Now, another curious one to me, because I was less familiar with this, was this idea of accumulating nickel. And so he's applying the same idea, all right? Nickel is being derived from erosion on the surface of the earth and then deposited in the seas, and so nickel should be building up. And if the seas were really hundreds of millions of years old, so much nickel should have accumulated that everything should be dead in the ocean. So it's like, well then, of course, the oceans cannot actually be old because there's life in the ocean today. And if there's life there, that means the nickel hasn't actually accumulated that much. And there's no easy way to explain how the nickel got out of the ocean, or at least according to this author. Now, where did he get this idea? Why is this in this article? I was interested. Like, where is this idea of nickel being a limiting factor for the age of the earth? And I looked at his references, and his reference took me to another article from Creation Magazine in 2016, although updated just this month, in which nickel concentration indicates young oceans. And I said, well, who's the author here? David White. Who is David White? I went to look, and they have a biography of David White. He's a creation physicist and food researcher. For the most part, he works on milk sensors. I don't see any evidence that he's ever done any biogeochemistry, really, in any sense. So here he is. This is your expert on nickel. And he goes and he does essentially he does the same thing that Humphreys and Austin do, right? That same paper that's all the way back in 1990 talking about the missing salt, which I think has some serious flaws in that particular article. He takes that and he says, well, I can just apply that to the idea of nickel. Just take another type of molecule and ask the same question. And so he does go out and he finds some references to non-creationist material, but all he's trying to do is show, like, what are the inputs, how much nickel goes in, and he does the basic types of calculations. Like, all right, this much nickel is thought to be going into the oceans each year, and here's one place where it may be coming out, and tries to do some kind of calculation using uniformitarian ideas, and says that, this can't happen. There's not enough nickel in the ocean if the oceans were very, very old. Honestly, it didn't take me very long. I did a couple Google Scholar searches, and I found a variety of articles about nickel, talking about nickel balance in the ocean. And then what are some ways that nickel may be removed from the ocean? Well, I found several different ways it can be removed from the ocean that he doesn't mention in his article. And then, of course, his article is being used by this other author to say that nickel is another evidence for the ocean being young. But when I trace it back and I ask, so how do you come to that conclusion? Well, here's just one example. Diatoms are single-celled organisms that produce glass cases. And there is a small amount of nickel that gets incorporated into that, and there are, a number too large to really write out of diatoms in the ocean. And when they die, their carcasses fall to the bottom of the ocean and form that ooze at the bottom of the ocean, part of the sediments that are down there. And so it's basically taking out nickel out of that. And then there's the whole non-uniformitarian idea of large amounts of sediments from the ocean floor actually being removed from the ocean by ocean crust being pushed up out on the surface, or from times in the past in which large amounts of sediment were placed on continental shelves, which then have been lifted up higher and turned into mountains, right? And so you have huge amounts of removal of nickel over time. Hundreds of millions of tons probably of nickel have been overall removed from the oceans. And he doesn't really accommodate or talk about that in his particular article. So it's an oversimplified use of uniformitarianism, using simple inputs and outputs, except that if you don't understand the outputs even today, you're going to come up with a bad calculation. But even if you had the numbers right, just extrapolating in the past isn't good enough. You have to look at what's the historical record of how the Earth has changed over time, and how might that have affected the inputs and the outputs. No one today would say that the inputs and the outputs had to stay constant over time. And that's why I say it's that the first author, the first article we're talking about, he sets up a false narrative of what uniformitarianism expects to see. It doesn't expect to see that the amount of input of salt or output of salt from the ocean has to have remained constant through time. How salt is eroded, all right, how sodium is deposited, and what the physical, like the processes of things that are happening, those things are things that we can expect to remain constant through time. All right, the basic fundamental principles of the way that this world operates, but the rates at which that happens, like the rate of input, is not a constant. It most certainly can change and vary, just as the amount of sediments being deposited in the ocean from a river can change from one season to another. We don't expect the exact same amount of sediment to be released from a river into the sea on every single day, right? And so back calculating and extrapolating into the past using these values is not a valid assessment or way of determining the age of the Earth. So at a minimum, these types of estimates they're not really able to tell us how old the Earth is. And by young Earth creationists' own admission, they're getting dates that are 10 million, hundreds of, 50 million, 60 million years old for the age of the ocean. And they're saying, well, then, the world can't be billions of years old. But they're not saying it's proof that the world is only 4,000 years old or 6,000 years old. They're just sort of trying to say, well, you're wrong, so therefore we might be right. All right? It's not actually evidence that the world is very young. It's just hopeful evidence that the world isn't old. But there are many, many different ways, problems with their particular analysis. And so in no way does it actually dispel the idea that the oceans might actually be much older than their estimates allow. Okay, that's a quick look at just a paper in Creation Magazine from Creation Ministries International. I would say this is representative of a lot of their articles. They're written by folks who don't necessarily have any expertise in those areas. They are just summaries, or I guess you could say they are they're review papers, except that all of the literature they use to review something is just other creation scientists. And so if those original creation science articles have errors in them, they're simply amplifying those errors as they continue to write and propagate this information out there. I mentioned my name's Joel Duff, and if you want to read more of my articles, you can go to thenaturalhistorian.com. Thanks very much.